We are going to be in Nehemiah chapter 4 this morning. And we're going to be looking at the responding to hindrance. When we look at Nehemiah chapter 4, we see that there are those that are trying to hinder the work that God has established for His people to do, specifically Nehemiah. And from this, what we see is in doing the Lord's work and going about and doing the things that He has commanded us to do, there are going to be those that for different motivations, they at certain times will work to hinder the work of God. When it is specifically those trying to fight against the work of God, it's really because they're trying to fight against God. But at the same time, this happens. It happens in many different areas. It happens from many different directions, and that we experience hindrances to the work of God through no fault of our own. And those that are doing it, they will seek to discourage us or to keep us from doing what we need to be doing. When this happens, what is our response to be? How are we to respond to these things? And I think that when we look at this, we see the way that we are to respond, the way that God expects us to respond to those that are actively trying to hinder the work of God. Nehemiah, in Nehemiah, the purpose, what he is trying to do, he has been tasked by God to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. On Wednesday nights, we've been going through the prophets, and we just finished Jeremiah. We've been in Lamentations, and at the end of Jeremiah, we saw the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians. Well, Nehemiah is coming back after the fall of Babylon, and he is coming back to rebuild Jerusalem. And he is doing it with the authority of the new king at that time. And so he has been sent, and he's been given this ability, and he's been given support, he's been given the resources to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, to make it a safe city again. In the process of doing this, very quickly, Nehemiah makes some enemies with those that are outside of, that are not Jews. And they don't want to see Jerusalem being rebuilt. They don't want to see it protected again. And so they actively, throughout Nehemiah, work to hinder that work. But we see from Nehemiah his response from it, and it can be an example for us as well. Chapter 4 really kind of shows us these things. So we don't have a text necessarily to read this morning. We're going to be looking at all of chapter 4, so I'm not going to read all of the chapter. So let's go ahead, and I'll ask you to go ahead and stand with me, and we'll have a word of prayer. Lord, I thank you that we have this opportunity to be here this morning, to be able to study your word, to be able to learn from it, to be able to see what your expectation is for us and the way that we respond to things that can be holding us back. I pray that you would soften our hearts and help us to be very much so focused on your word and focus what your will is in our lives. I ask that you would guide and direct my words as I teach your word, that our time here this morning would be fruitful, and that everything ultimately would be for your honor, your glory, and your will. In Jesus' name, amen. You may be seated. We begin here in chapter 4, the beginning of it, we see that the work of rebuilding the walls is making progress. And we see that as a result of that, those in Jerusalem, the Jews, began to receive a bit of reproach for it, or those that are trying to actively work against it. We look in Nehemiah chapter 4, and we see here in verse 4, or chapter 4 in verse 1, it says, "But it came to pass that when Sanballat heard that we builded the wall, he was wroth and took great indignation and mocked the Jews. And he spake before his brethren in the army of Samaria and said, What do these feeble Jews? Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of the rubbish which are burned? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was by him, and he said, Even that which they build, if a fox go up, he shall even break down their stone wall." So we see that they are making progress in the building up. If you go back into the chapter 3, it talks about them rebuilding the gates and rebuilding certain portions of the wall. And so Sanballat here and those with him were very upset about this. And if we go back to chapter 2 and we look at verses 9 and 10, we see the first instance of these men. If we look at verse 9, this is Nehemiah talking. He says, "Then I came to the governors beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel." So we see upon Nehemiah's arrival, and as he mentions here, he had the support of the king to come and to do this. He was not doing anything that was illegal. He was not doing anything that trying to overthrow the kingdom or to go against it. He was doing what he was allowed to do. But these men, they didn't like the Jews. They didn't like Jerusalem. And so when they hear that Nehemiah has come and that his purpose is to rebuild Jerusalem, they go and they say, "We don't want this. We don't want," they're very upset that somebody was coming to do good to the city of Jerusalem. And if you go down farther in chapter 2 and look at verse 19, we see they begin their attacks against Nehemiah. It says in verse 19, "But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian heard it, they laughed us to scorn and despised us and said, What is this thing that ye do? Will ye rebel against the king?" What they first begin with is verbally attacking Nehemiah and those that are with him, saying, "You're not going to be able to do this. Why are you doing these things, you small person?" And they say, "Is your intentions to go and to rebel against the king?" They're trying to apply here that Nehemiah's desire, that Nehemiah's direction is to do something that is treasonous. And so when we go back into chapter 4, where we began, we see that, as I mentioned, chapter 3 really begins the work. And in chapter 4, we've gotten to the point where progress has been made in rebuilding the wall. And as we read, Sanballat and those with him, they become very mad about this progress and again begin to mock the Jews. And if you look in verse 2 at the way he talks, he says, "And he spake before his brethren in the army of Samaria and said, What do these feeble Jews? Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of the rubbish which are burned?" He's mocking them, and he's saying, these feeble Jews, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're able to accomplish. They're wasting their time. This is so sad. And even here, I want you to notice this, that he says, will they make an end to a day? One of the things that we see from the Jews is that they were working around the clock in rebuilding the wall. They were putting all of their effort. They were working hard at this. And Sanballat even takes this, which you would look at those that are working hard in this kind of endeavor, you would think that's a good thing. And Sanballat, he goes and he ridicules them for working hard at this. saying they're doing this hard work and they're not going to even be able to finish. He even comments that they're not going to be able to revive their heaps of rubbish. And his buddy Tobiah, you look in verse 3, he says, now Tobiah the Ammonite was by him, and he said, even that which they built, if a fox go up, he shall even break down their stone wall. And Tobiah is saying, what they've accomplished, a fox could run and jump over it and it would fall down. They haven't done anything of value. They haven't accomplished anything. These are just dumb Jews. And their intention, they're speaking before the armies of Samaria. They're trying to build up support to go and to attack Nehemiah and to attack those that are rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, to stop it dead in their tracks. And these men, they're looking at us and they're saying these things which are not true in this instance. And their purpose is to undermine and discourage the Jews. Their purpose is to turn other people against them, to cause problems, to keep this from taking place. I want you to think about this, though. When hindrances take place, and whatever it may be, for the work that we have for the Lord, when these hindrances take place, and when people actively try to fight against it, to discourage it, it can be easy to focus on the problems. It can be easy to focus on the hindrances, what is coming across. And it can be easy to be tempted to respond in the same manner. To respond in the same way that they are responding to you and what you were doing. When we continue in this and we begin looking at our next section of verses, we see the way that God expects us to respond to this. Nehemiah does not respond in kind to the same way that they are attacking him. He does not even really do anything to them. He turns it over to the Lord. Look at verse 4 and we see the response of Nehemiah. It says, "Hear, O our God, for we are despised, and turn their reproach upon their own head, and give them for prey in the land of captivity, and cover not their iniquity, and let not their sin be blotted out from before thee, for they have provoked thee to anger before the builders." Now he goes and he begins here by making a prayer to the Lord. He does not respond by taking matters into his own hands. He does not respond by attacking them or discrediting them and their authority or who they are. He responds by seeking the Lord. He requests of the Lord to deal with the things that are taking place here and to respond to them in the right way. We don't see it very clearly here, but we see it elsewhere in Scripture very clearly that when we pray to the Lord, our desire and our focus should be trusting the Lord's will and asking for the Lord to do as He sees fit. And so Nehemiah, he is listing these things that he has done, and he has said, Lord, you deal with these things. You respond to these things in the way that it needs to be responded to. I want you to realize here that his focus is not, some of these terms that we see here, you would understand it. It could be understood as Nehemiah asking that they may not have the opportunity for salvation or this like. But really, he's focusing on the flesh here, and what he's saying is, Lord, do not let them take their actions without having consequences for those actions. Do not have mercy on them because they are doing these things against you. When we do evil or we take poor actions, the Lord has the choice to either punish us and to allow the consequences of that, or He has the choice to have mercy and to remove consequences or to withhold punishment. Nehemiah is saying, Lord, you take care of this, but don't go easy on it. But he is turning it to the Lord. He's placing it in God's hands. And this is an important thing, because in our own workings and the things that we do, we can be wrong. There can be parts of a situation, or there can be different areas within it that we don't fully understand. Effects that we don't know. But in the case of the Lord, He knows in great detail everything that takes place. He knows the effect. He knows what needs to be done. He can always respond in a righteous, in a just way. But with us, there's ample opportunity for us to respond in an unrighteous manner or in an unjust way. But turning it over to the Lord, that guarantees that it is dealt with in a righteous and just way. As I said, the temptation oftentimes is for us to respond in kind or to take matters into our own hands and to try and fight those individuals or to stick it to them. But God doesn't need our help with that. God doesn't need us to do those things. God needs us to do what we're supposed to be doing for ourselves. He can take care of those individuals as is needed. It's not our place. And Nehemiah knows this. He knows he's got plenty to do on his own. And this is another thing too, when we continue and we get into verse 6, he says, so we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together into the half thereof, for the people had a mind to work. As we continue with this, and as I'm sure you can understand, the rebuilding of a wall is not an easy endeavor, right? It's not a simple thing. It requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of time. We see that one of the things I already mentioned is that they were working around the clock on it. And then we actually will see this within this chapter. They talk about working around the clock on it and not even taking off their clothes except to wash them. Like there was no relaxing. And so this is the thing. We have a ton of work that needs to be done. They have an immense amount of things that God has given for us to accomplish and for us to be doing for Him. We don't need to be wasting our time dealing with something that God can deal with in a better way. Because we've got plenty of work to do on our own. And see, if Nehemiah had decided to go and to assemble the people of Jerusalem, the Jews, and to assemble them together in battle and to go and to attack Sanballat and Tobias and the armies of Samaria and do all this, what would that have required? It would have required the work on the wall to stop. It would have required them to leave the work that God had for them. As a result, the potential could be for many to die that otherwise would no longer be able to work on the wall. So our second response, the first response is to pray to God, but the second response is to continue the work that God has given us. After turning the individuals causing problems over to God, Nehemiah and those with him got back to work. They worked hard and had a focus on working, so much that they got half the wall completed. They made very good time with this. They accomplished a lot. Half the wall was built. Instead of getting distracted by the problems of the flesh, they focused on God's mission. It is easy to get distracted by the things going on in the flesh, by things that are going on in this world, but we need to stay focused on God's work. And what is our work? Our work is summed up in the Great Commission. To be sharing the gospel, to be baptizing those who accept the Lord, and to be making disciples and growing in the Lord. That is our mission. And we cannot lose sight of that. Whatever there may be going on in our world. We look at our building and we've had, over the past few years, we've had things that have stalled it out that we thought we had be done very early on, but things have kept coming up. Things out of our control. And it can be easy to get discouraged by that, but that is not something that we should allow to keep us from sharing the gospel and from baptizing and from being disciples. We can't let it do that. Does it create some instances where we got to get creative with things? Maybe. But you got to remember that the original church, the early churches, they didn't have church buildings. They did it. And I'd argue they did a really good job carrying out the Great Commission. I think it's very clear in Scripture. The Jerusalem church did not have a church building. And they grew by hundreds, thousands. You can't let it stop you. You can't let it slow you down. You can't let it discourage you. Because the work that God has for us is of much greater importance. And even in the case that we see here with Nehemiah and those working on the wall, they didn't slow down with this potential. Now, I look at this and I see, and to me, it really looks like that they doubled down on what they were doing. They worked harder in spite of it. Just kept doing what God had for them. We need to just let God deal with the hindrances, and we just keep keeping on. Keep working. Our mission is the gospel and making disciples and baptizing. And we cannot get distracted by those causing problems, whatever they may be, to forget the mission that we have been given. When we continue here in Nehemiah chapter 4, we see the effect of this. We've already seen a bit of this. But let's look at verse 7. It says, "But it came to pass that when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up and that the breaches began to be stopped, then they were very wroth, and conspired all of them together to come and to fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it." We see in this case, with what's going on, that those that were trying to fight against it, when they found out that the work that God had was continuing to progress in spite of that, they became mad. And they themselves doubled down on their efforts to hinder the Lord's work. And this is a thing to remember. When we are successful at the Lord's work, there are going to be others, or there may be those that will increase their efforts to try and hinder it. Now, I have not mentioned him yet, but the one that is going to seek to try and do the most work to try and hinder when the Lord's churches are being active and are accomplishing God's work is Satan. Been a part of the instances. I've had other churches too that I know of, talking to pastors, that things will be going really great. And you got to remember that when things are going really good, Satan's getting ready to attack. because he doesn't like it. I know a pastor that they had a lot of people that were coming and joining, and their church was growing, and things were going really well. And in the process of all these people coming and becoming a member in the church growing, there was this couple of families that allowed themselves to be deceived by Satan and left the church and took others with them. And I remember the pastor saying, he's like, the Lord is doing all of these great things and He's working in all these ways, and then these people over here just like causing these problems within their church. Now, some of them I did hear later on, I came back and apologized and rejoined with the church. But nonetheless, you have this problem that came that was the attack of Satan. When things are good, you got to watch out for them. When you're accomplishing God's work, you got to watch, because Satan's going to attack. And there are going to be those that won't like God's work being done, and they're going to attack as well. And this is what happened in the case of Nehemiah. But regardless, our response needs to be to pray and to keep working. Look at verse 9. It says, nevertheless, we made our prayer unto our God and set a watch against them day and night because of them. Jeremiah responds and he says, nonetheless, we heard about these things, so we prayed to God. We said, I think it was probably a very similar prayer to what he had before, where he said, Lord, you take care of it. You deal with it. We're going to keep doing what we have to be doing. And that's what they did. And now, Nehemiah did take seriously the threats that are being made. And so he goes and he says, and so in response to that, to protect ourselves, he says, they put up watches. And we'll see later on that this continued, that they had those that were set to be defending and those that were set to be working. And they did this because they needed to be prepared, because they had the threat of attack for what was being done. But they did not leave the work to go into attack. They stayed and they kept doing what they needed to do. They trusted the Lord to deal with it outside of that. They were just going to be prepared if somebody were to attack, to defend. We continue and we see in verse 10, it says, and Judah said, the strength of the bearers of burdens is decayed, and there is much rubbish, so that we are not able to build the wall. And our adversaries said, they shall not know, neither see, till we come in the midst among them, and slay them, and cause the work to cease. And it came to pass that when the Jews which dwelt by them came, they said unto us 10 times, from all places whence ye have returned unto you, they will be upon you. And we see as the work continues that there is a bit of discouragement, that the people are beginning to be worn out. There is a lot of work left to be done. It doesn't seem like they can achieve it. And then they have those that are threatening to come and attack, and they're telling others on their way to Jerusalem, saying, hey, we're going to come and attack you guys. We're coming. And they even threaten, they say that, and we're going to come, and you're not going to know that we're there until we kill you. I say we're discouraged, we're fearful, concerned about what's going on here. It's completely natural to become discouraged and tired when working hard. Even without others coming and actively trying to hinder it, when working a lot and working hard, you become tired and you can become discouraged. However, we cannot allow that. We cannot allow ourselves to stop in the work that is before us. So we look at Nehemiah's response, verse 13. It says, "Therefore set I in the lower places behind the wall, and on the higher places I even set the people after their families with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and rose up and said unto the nobles and the rulers and to the rest of the people, Be not afraid of them. Remember the Lord, which is great and terrible. Fight for your brethren, your sons and your daughters and your wives and your houses." And so Nehemiah responds, and he organizes the people in a fashion to protect them from those that were seeking to destroy. And then he encouraged them, and he reminded the people of their work, and reminded them that God is a great and terrible God. That he says, we've got this work to be done, and we're gonna protect ourselves. But remember, the Lord in His greatness is greater than these that are trying to attack. The Lord knows what is going on. The Lord has the ability to do whatever needs to be done. And so you let the Lord deal with that. You don't have to worry about it. The Lord is going to work it out. The Lord is going to protect us. He has that ability. We're doing what God has called us to do, and so He's going to help us. So you don't need to worry. You don't need to fear. Their only need is to remember that they are working for their families. Their burden and the enemies may seem great. However, the Lord is greater. And in addition, the work that is being accomplished is of greater importance. This is the thing to remember. When there are earthly problems, is that earthly problems have earthly consequences. Those that are seeking to hinder, all they can affect is things of earthly significance. But when it comes to the work of God and what God is able to accomplish, it has eternal consequences. Has an eternal effect. We can't allow ourselves to get distracted by the things that really truly have an earthly consequence. We need to be responding, and we need to be working and focusing our efforts on the things that have eternal, heavenly consequences. The worst that anybody here on earth can do to destroy and to hurt is of earthly consequence. But we have the ability through the Lord and sharing His Word and teaching His Word and carrying out His work, we have the ability to take people and to lead them to the Lord so that He can save them and so that He can change their eternity. Don't get distracted by the flesh and forget the Spirit. No matter how great the problem may seem to be, God is greater. And God's work is more important. So in response to this, we see their continuing work. They continue in their work. And the first thing I want us to notice in their continuing work is that they supported each other. Look at verse 15. "And it came to pass, when our enemies heard that it was known unto us, and God had brought their counsel to naught, that we returned all of us to the wall, every one unto his work." That we see that as a result of the words of Nehemiah, the work of their enemies, and really Nehemiah reminded them that the Lord is going to take care of us. So Nehemiah reminded them that the Lord's going to take care of us, and the Lord dealt with it. The Lord caused their counsel, their works, and their their effect to try and accomplish to keep them from doing it to come to naught, that they never actually are able to do anything. You see, Sanballat and Tobias, they were trying to raise up an army against them, to destroy them and to kill them. Nothing happened because of what the Lord did. And not only that, but their desire to attack came to nothing, but their desire to see the walls of Jerusalem not be rebuilt came to nothing. Now the Lord dealt with it, but let's think about it in these terms. Had those of Jerusalem become discouraged and quit working, Sanballat would have won. Because his goal was to stop the building of the walls. I want you to understand something here. Let's talk about Satan some more. As a saved believer, he can't take away your salvation. He can't change he's already lost you. But he has a goal to make you ineffective. He knows that you have the ability. He knows he's lost. He knows that one day, he knows that he is condemned to go to hell. Okay? To go to the lake of fire. He knows that. But he has a goal to take everybody down with him. And even though he knows that he has lost you, he wants to keep you from doing anything that may lead somebody else to the Lord. You see, Sanballat, Tobiah, they lost in their endeavor to try and attack. But had the Jews given up, they would have won in their efforts to keep the wall from being built. But because the Jews and Nehemiah stayed focused on the work that God had for them, they lost in both counts. The work kept going on. They kept building the wall. The best response to our enemies is to make their work of no effect. Just keep doing what God has commanded. Let God deal with their problems. We work on the mission that's before us. And our mission is the gospel. Baptizing, making disciples. We see verse 16, it says, "And it came to pass from that time forth, that half of my servants wrought in the work, and the other half of them held both spears and shields and bows. And they were harbingers and rulers were behind all the house of Judah. They which builded on the wall, and they that bear burdens, and those that laid it, every one with one of his hands wrought in the work, and with the other hand held a weapon. For the builders, every one had his sword girded by his side, and so builded, and he that sounded the trumpet was by me." And see, they continue on. Prepare. It's an interesting thought. I've always, in reading this, it's always been an interesting thought to me to think of a builder that has a hammer in one hand and a sword in the other hand. I've worked a lot of jobs, and I've never had to hold a gun in one hand and a hammer in the other because of what I was doing. But that's what they needed to do, so that's what they did. They worked hard. Every one of them. We continue and look at verse 19. It says, "And I said unto the nobles, and to the rulers, and to the rest of the people, the work is great and large, and we are separated upon the wall, one far from another." Nehemiah, he makes this statement. He says, the work that we're doing, it's a big project. They're rebuilding the walls around a city. We're not talking about them, some working in this room and some working in this. We're talking about some working on one side and some working on the other side, unable to see each other or hear each other. He says, this is a really big project that we have going on here. This is a really big work. And this would naturally place their strength in a divided fashion. We're all familiar with the saying, divided they fall. So look at what verse 20. He says, in what place, therefore, ye hear the sound of the trumpet, resort ye thither unto us. Our God shall fight for us. And so Nehemiah says, if you hear the trumpet, wherever you hear the trumpet coming from, you run to that place to support your brethren that are there. He says, you hear the call for help, you come running. Come and help wherever it is, wherever it's needed. And doing our work for the Lord, we all have our own jobs within the mission of God. We all have our own individual missions that we have as a greater body. And it's a great big work that we have before us. Because we're all working in different parts of the city. We're all working in different parts of the area, doing different things. But we cannot be divided. We cannot allow ourselves to be alone. If someone needs help, ask. And if someone asks, come running. You know, there's two parts to this in order for there to be support, is that those that get attacked, they got to sound the trumpet. They got to sound the alarm. Hey, we need help. And then those that hear it have to be listening for it, and then when they hear it, they come running. You know, we're all working on our different things and working in different areas, but when you need help, you need to ask for it. And then when somebody asks, you got to run. You got to come quick. I've had people that I've known, that I've talked to, that they have these problems that you find out about well after the fact. And sometimes even people get very upset that nobody helped. And I'm not saying this is always the case, but I know times where it has been the case. Where the reason nobody helped is because they never said anything. Say something. Ask. Don't assume people aren't going to help. Don't assume whatever the reason is. That we're here to help each other. Ask. And then when somebody asks, come running. Don't walk. Don't dilly-dally. Come running. So we got to help each other. We got to support each other. And then we continue and we see that we need to be working diligently. Verse 21. It says, so we labored in the work. Half of them held the spears from the rising of the morning until the stars appeared. Likewise, at the same time said I unto the people, let every one with a servant lodge in Jerusalem, that in the night they may be guard to us, and labor on the day. So neither I, nor my brethren, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard which followed me, none of us put off our clothes, saving that every one put them off for washing. And we see, in addition to supporting each other, we need to remain diligently laboring in the work. Remember that if they had stopped, the enemy won. The enemy won. In spite of all that was happening, the people of Jerusalem kept working. They didn't let the threat of an attack cause them to run and hide. They did not all stop working on the wall to defend either. They responded to the threat and the hindrance to protect themselves and to deal with as needed. But that didn't mean they stopped working. They split the load. Some worked on the wall, and some dealt with the potential attack. And I want you to notice this in verse 22. That he says, likewise, at the same time I said unto the people, let every one with a servant lodge within Jerusalem. He says, let every one. But I want you to remember this too. All the people contributed. The hardest part, or what makes difficulties harder, is when only some people help. What makes problems harder is when only some people help. When everyone pitches in, the work is easier and less of a burden to the few. Think of how much harder this work on the wall would have been if only half of the people contributed. What would have happened is half of the people that were working would have had to spend all their time defending, and there would have been none to work. You see, whenever there are those that do not contribute, then whenever something comes along, there is work that gets left behind because there's nobody that can do it. There's only so much time people have in the day, and so eventually you get to the point where things just don't get done. And then the enemy wins. Then Satan wins. And I want you to notice this, verse 23. He says, so neither I, nor my brethren, nor my servants, nor the men of the guard which followed me, none of us put off our clothes, saving that every one put them off for washing. So Nehemiah says, me and my men and those that are with me, none of us took off our clothes unless everybody else was taking them off and washing them. And I want you to understand this. In order for the work to continue, it may require, I'm not going to say may, it is going to require sacrifice. You know, sometimes we tell ourselves, well, I'm busy and I can't contribute. Well, I want you to understand something. Everybody is busy. Everybody has lives. Everybody has other things that they are trying to accomplish. You're not the only one that has things going on that you're doing that's taking up your time. It just requires that you have a little sacrifice. That you find the way to make it work. I'm not saying that you give up everything that needs to be done, but I've known people that you would look at their lives and you'd say there's no way they have any time for the Lord, and yet they spend more time than somebody that you would look at their life and you'd say they have tons of time available. They make it work. That's why. We all have our hindrances. We all have the things that hold us back. We all have the things that can keep us from it. The important thing is that we stay focused on what God has and we continue doing what we can. And don't allow yourself to be thinking, well, I don't know what to do. Or I don't have the abilities, or I'm not fully equipped. You know, sometimes I have people that they'll work with me on something. Stephen helped me with my basement, and Mike did too. And sometimes Stephen, he sometimes says, Kinsey too will say, I don't really know how much help I'm giving you. But my response is always, well, whatever you do, I didn't have to do. And that's not diminishing how much they're able to accomplish. It's saying that it's less that somebody else has to do. Even if it took you 2 minutes to do something that it took me a minute to do, it saved a minute of my time that I could put into something else. It's still help. It's still getting things accomplished that lightens the load on somebody else. So no matter how little you think you have to offer, it may be a lot more than you realize. Because I've had people that said I didn't have anything to offer, that I looked at it and went, actually, you did a lot for me. Or you did a lot for this other person. You did accomplish a lot. You just didn't realize you had that potential. But if you never tried, you never would have gotten anything done. So put in the work. Put in the effort. And here's something too. If you're not very good at it, the more you do it, the better you're going to get. Experience. The only way you can get experience is by doing it. It's the only way you're going to get better. Don't let the lack of experience be something that keeps you from trying, from learning, from doing better. Even those that are the most skilled at the things that they do had to learn and didn't know what they were doing at some point in time. There's not any of us that were born with just this perfect ability to do it. Some learn a little bit faster at certain things. But everybody started at some point in time where they had no understanding of how to do anything. But we all learned. So how do we respond to those that hinder? What do we do? Or any source of hindering? Well, we turn it over to the Lord. We'll let God deal with it. And then we keep on keeping on, regardless what it is. And we do it together. We support each other. We lift each other up. And we do it diligently. We work hard at it. Every one of us. Because the consequences are eternal in their effect. I want us to go ahead and stand. We're going to have